Let's talk about the Victorian era. And I know what you might be thinking, dusty history books, right? But what if I told you that era isn't just history? What if it's the foundational operating system for the world you're living in right now?
To really get the sheer scale of this change, just look at this. In the span of a single human lifetime, the entire planet went from being run by the sun, the seasons, and good old-fashioned muscle to being completely re-engineered. Suddenly, it's a world of steel, steam, and copper wire. This wasn't just a simple update, it was a complete system reboot.
So to really appreciate that rupture, we've got to look at the world before it all happened. Let's call it a world unplugged.
I mean, this quote just says it all, doesn't it? Imagine your entire day, your whole life, being set not by a clock, but by the sunrise and sunset. Your productivity wasn't about data or efficiency, it was about raw horsepower, either from an actual horse or from your own body. That was it. That was the reality.
And then came the great re-engineering. This wasn't just a slow evolution. It was a profound rupture point in history, a moment where humanity decided to aggressively rewrite the basic rules of physical reality.
And the crazy thing is how fast it all happened. Take a look at this timeline. In just over 60 years, we go from the start of Victoria's reign to the Great Exhibition, this massive, world-changing showcase of industrial power. And then, boom, the Telegraph connects the globe. It was the original internet, and it completely annihilated the very concept of distance.
So if you take away one thing, it's this. The Victorians wrote the source code for our modern world. Our industrial, social, and technological operating systems, they were all coded during this period. That's why people call it the crucible of modernity. It's where everything melted down and was forged into something new.
And these were the engines driving that change. Bessemer steel, that's what made skyscrapers and massive bridges possible. Coal-powered steam engines fueled the factories and the railways that shrunk the world. And electricity, the manipulation of electromagnetic fields, gave us new kinds of power, new kinds of light. And those copper wires, they literally became a global nervous system, flashing information across the planet at nearly the speed of light.
But see, you can't install all that new hardware and expect the old software to run on it. This technological explosion forced a complete rewrite of the rules for human society itself.
Just look at this graph. It's staggering. In only 70 years, the population of the United Kingdom doubled. This wasn't just a little bump. It was a demographic bomb going off, and it completely shattered the old way of life.
So what happens when that bomb goes off? Well, you get a massive migration. People poured out of the countryside and into these brand new, smoke-filled industrial cities. And this created entirely new kinds of people. A huge urban working class, the proletariat, and a fast-growing middle class. And what did this new middle class want? They wanted stuff. Goods, status, things to buy. And just like that, the modern consumer economy was born.
But all of this change, all this progress, came with this deep, unsettling tension. And that brings us to what you could call the progress paradox. It was an age defined by both incredible optimism and crippling anxiety.
The Victorian mind was basically split right down the middle. On one side, you had this boundless, almost arrogant belief that science and technology could conquer any problem, could completely master nature. But on the other side, there was this deep, gnawing fear about what that mastery would actually cost, a fear of the chaos and social upheaval it would unleash.
And you see this paradox playing out in their actual reality. I mean, this was an era of incredible political progress. You had movements fighting for the right to vote, the abolition of slavery. Amazing stuff. And yet, at the exact same time, it was the era of horrific slums, of brutal, dehumanizing factory conditions, progress and peril, living right next door to each other.
So why does any of this matter to us today? Because their world, with all its contradictions and innovations, is still fundamentally our world. We're living with our Victorian inheritance every single day.
You see, the Victorians invented so much more than just machines. They invented concepts, systems, and whole ways of thinking that are now so baked into our lives that we don't even notice them anymore.
This is it. This is the foundational architecture of the 21st century. The information age? It didn't start with the internet. It started with the telegraph. Our world of synthetic plastics and materials? It started with their invention of aniline dyes. Global supply chains? They're just a high-tech version of the steam-powered networks the Victorians built. And maybe the biggest one of all? They created the very idea of technological obsolescence, that constant feeling that your device is already out of date, that you need the next upgrade. Sound familiar?
And that really brings us to this final thought. Understanding the Victorian era isn't just a history lesson, it's like watching a recording of the birth of our own world, complete with all its amazing potential and all of its deep, complicated anxieties.
All right, today we're going to dive into the visceral, world-altering power of steam. Now, this wasn't just some new machine. It was a force that literally powered an empire and fundamentally rewired how humanity lived, worked, and even experienced time itself. You know, the funny thing is, the steam engine wasn't actually invented during the Victorian era, but that's when it really, truly came of age. It went from being a simple pump to this mobile, high-pressure powerhouse that, for the first time ever, freed humanity from the limits of muscle and animal power. It became the beating heart of the center of everything.
So where did this incredible new power source make its first and probably most visible impact? Well, it was in the factories. Steam completely upended where and how people worked, and in doing so, it forged the modern industrial city.
Before steam, industry was literally tethered to the landscape. You had to build your mills out in rural valleys, right next to a fast-flowing river to get that water power. But the steam engine, it just cut that cord. It meant you could build factories wherever the resources were, right next to the coal fields and the big pools of labor. And that is what created the sprawling industrial cities we now think of, places like Manchester and Sheffield. This shift also changed the very rhythm of daily life. I mean, in an agrarian society, your day was regulated by the sun and the seasons. Simple. But in the factory, oh no. Your life was now regulated by the relentless, pounding pace of the engine and the piercing blast of the factory whistle. The machine just ran and ran, demanding these long, rigid hours that completely shattered the natural cycles workers were used to. And yeah, this mechanization led to an absolutely incredible expansion of production, but the human cost was just immense. You had workers facing endless hours in choking pollution, while cities saw the explosion of slums where poverty and disease could just run rampant. Steam had built the modern city, but man, it was a brutal architect. But steam didn't just stay locked up in the factory. Oh no. The moment it was put on wheels, it began to completely warp our very concepts of distance and time. And the change happened with just breathtaking speed. I mean, the first modern railway line opens in 1838. By 1845, that's just 7 years later, a full-blown railway mania was sweeping the nation, making train travel a brand new reality for pretty much everyone. The impact was total. Before the railway, Britain was basically a collection of isolated towns and villages. The railway stitched them all together into one cohesive unit. Goods, coal, iron, suddenly everything was fluid, and that allowed the economy to scale to these massive imperial proportions. It even created entire new industries out of thin air, like the seaside holiday, because now even working-class families could travel for fun. But here's the thing. Moving people and stuff around was only part of the revolution. The railway's most profound impact was actually something you couldn't even see. Any guesses what it was? It was time itself. Before trains, time was local. When the sun was highest in the sky in Bristol, that was noon. But that was several minutes different from noon in London. You just can't run a train schedule like that without constant collisions. So the railways imposed a single, unified railway time, which eventually became Greenwich Mean Time, across the entire country. For the first time ever, the whole nation was synchronized, not to the sun, but to the mechanical beat of the engine. Okay, so we always picture steam with city smog, right? But its power also radically transformed the countryside. This happened through the introduction of the steam traction engine, basically the iron horse of the fields. To really get the impact here, you have to imagine what it was like before. Threshing, that's separating grain from the stalk, was just torturous manual labor done with hand flails. It was such back-breaking, exhausting work that it took up nearly a quarter of all the labor in agriculture. And then came the portable steam engine and the mechanical thresher. And the increase in productivity, it wasn't just big, it was absolutely staggering. These machines could increase a farm's daily production by 100-fold. That's 100 times more grain processed in a single day. Just incredible. And these things were absolute behemoths. Some weighed over 20 tons and needed a whole crew just to operate. People called them noisy, friendly monsters that would travel from farm to farm, and their arrival would signal the start of the harvest, a time of really intense communal work. But this change wasn't always peaceful. For all their friendly noise, These machines put huge numbers of farm laborers out of a job, and this led to violent uprisings like the swing riots, where desperate workers would actually smash the very engines they feared were going to starve them. You see, progress always has a price. And this brings us to our final and maybe most surprising connection. You see, those lumbering iron giants from the Victorian fields, they are the direct ancestors of the car that's probably sitting in your driveway right now. So how do we know this? The connection is a guy named Henry Ford. He remembered so vividly that as a child in Michigan, a steam traction engine was the very first self-propelled vehicle he ever laid eyes on. Not a car, but one of these massive farm engines. That single moment was his inspiration. It sparked the idea for his own horseless carriage. You can literally trace the technological line right here, from those massive steam engines that broke the soil to the automotive revolution that would completely define the 20th century. Just take a look around you, wherever you are. Chances are something made of steel is right there in your line of sight. It's in our cars, our kitchens, but most importantly, it's the hidden skeleton holding up the very world we live in. For well over a century, steel has been the literal backbone of modern civilization. But, it wasn't always this way. For thousands of years, humanity built with stone, with timber, and with iron. So what changed? How did we make that incredible leap to this revolutionary material that let us build bigger, taller, and stronger than anyone had ever dreamed of? Well, let's dive in. So, to really get this, we've got to go back. We need to understand the world before cheap steel. This was a world with enormous ambition, but it was a world that was constantly slamming into the physical limits of the materials it had to work with. Before the mid-1850s, steel was basically a luxury item. Yeah, you'd find it in a masterfully crafted sword or a tiny watch spring, but you definitely weren't building a bridge out of it. The real workhorses of the day were iron and stone, and they had some serious drawbacks. Cast iron, for instance, was strong when you squeezed it, but it was brittle. It could just snap with no warning. Wrought iron was a bit more forgiving, but it was soft. Neither one had that magical combination of strength and flexibility that you need for the gigantic structures people were imagining. The stage was set, right? The world was desperate for a breakthrough. And in 1856, boy, did it get one. It came from an English inventor named Henry Bessemer, and his solution was fiery. It was violent, and it was an absolutely brilliant process that would, quite literally, change the world. So what was this big idea? Well, at its core, the Bessemer process is this incredibly clever, almost magical chemical trick. Bessemer figured out that if you just blast air through molten iron, the oxygen in that air would react with all the junk you don't want, like excess carbon, and simply burn it all away. And this is where the real genius kicks in. You pour the molten pig iron into this big pear-shaped container they called a converter. You hit it with that blast of air, and the process fuels itself. See, when those impurities burn off, they create a ton of their own heat, which keeps the metal nice and liquid. A batch of steel that used to take weeks of hard labor to produce could now be made in about 20 minutes. It's just staggering. And you can bet this wasn't some quiet, clean process. Oh no. The source material we're looking at describes it perfectly as this spectacular eruption of flame and sparks. It became this incredible visual, a symbol of a whole new age of industrial power. You weren't just making steel, you were literally watching a new world being forged. Now this is where you see the real revolution. The economic impact was just mind-blowing. Take a look at this chart showing the price of steel rails, which were crucial for the railroad boom. In 1873, a ton cost $100. Now look at that second bar. By the 1890s, the price had completely cratered, down to just $18 a ton. That's not just a price drop, that's a total game changer. Steel went from being almost a precious metal to an everyday building block. Okay, so it was fast, it was cheap, but the Bessemer process wasn't perfect, not by a long shot. Because it was so fast and furious, quality could be all over the place. A big problem was that it couldn't get rid of phosphorus, an impurity that makes steel brittle. Some early batches were even described as being rotten hot and rotten cold. This is what led to another method, the open hearth process. It was slower, sure, but it gave you way more control and you ended up with the higher quality steel needed for the really big jobs. So now we've got this new wonder material. It's affordable, it's strong, so what do we do with it? Well, for starters, we start looking up. The race to the sky had officially begun. You see, the real key here is a total shift in how people thought about building.
With an old-school masonry building, the thick stone walls had to hold up all the weight. The taller you went, the ridiculously thick the walls at the bottom had to be, which just ate up space. But with a steel frame, you have an internal skeleton that does all the heavy lifting. The outer walls, they're basically just curtains to keep the rain out. This meant buildings could soar to heights that were just science fiction before, with massive windows letting in all this light. And the building that kicked it all off, the pioneer of this new world, the Home Insurance Building in Chicago, finished up in 1885. This is widely considered to be the world's very first skyscraper. And what's so cool about this building is that it's like a fossil, you know? It perfectly captures this exact moment of technological change. They actually started building it with an old-fashioned iron frame, but while it was being built, the famous Carnegie steel mills came to the architect with a brand new product, Bessemer steel beams, and he said, sure. He used them for the upper floors, making this building this amazing hybrid of old and new, a monument to a revolution happening right there on the job site. But it wasn't just about going up, it was also about going across. Steel allowed engineers to conquer vast new frontiers, to bridge gaps that were once thought completely impossible. And you have to understand the context here, it's so important. In 1879, the Tay Bridge in Scotland, a bridge built with iron, collapsed during a violent storm, and more than 75 people died. It was a national tragedy, a real trauma. So for the next massive bridge project, the engineers needed a material they could absolutely trust their lives with. They needed a steel. And that project was the Fourth Bridge. The scale of this thing, I mean, it is just on another level. It used 54,000 tons of that higher quality open hearth steel. The whole structure was held together by an unbelievable 6.5 million individual rivets. And it stretched for 2.5 kilometers across the water. That's over 1.5 miles, a distance that would have been absolutely unthinkable just a decade earlier with iron. So the Fourth Bridge wasn't just a way to get across some water. No, it was a massive statement. It was a vindication for the engineers and for steel itself. It proved on a truly monumental scale that steel could do what iron simply couldn't. It set a whole new standard for what was possible. So when you take a step back and you put it all together, that fiery breakthrough in the Bessemer converter, the soaring skeletons of the first skyscrapers, the colossal spans of these new bridges, you're really watching the dawn of a new era. This was the age of steel. You know, there's a quote from our source material that just hits the nail on the head. It says, if steam provided the kinetic energy of the Victorian age, steel provided its skeletal structure. And that's it, right? Steam power made the world move, but it was steel that gave that world its shape, its strength, and its permanence.
Okay, so when you hear the name Alexander Graham Bell, what's the first thing that pops into your head? The telephone, right? Of course. It completely changed the world, made him a legend. But what if I told you the invention that made him famous wasn't the one he was most proud of? Not even close. You see, Bell's real genius is hiding in a bunch of other incredible inventions you've probably never even heard of. So let's dig in.
So I'll just ask you straight up, what was his greatest invention? Now, if you're still thinking about that device we all used to make calls on, well, you're right about which one made him a household name, but you'd be wrong about which one was his favorite. Bell himself had a very, very different answer.
He actually said this back in 1880, describing what he thought was his greatest achievement. I have heard the articulate speech produced by sunlight. I have heard a ray of the sun laugh and cough and sing. Now, that's not him being poetic. He was literally describing a real device, an invention he believed was way more important than the telephone.
What he was talking about was the photophone. Yeah, the photophone. It was a device that could transmit your voice on a beam of light. I know, it sounds like something straight out of Star Trek, but this was a very real piece of 19th century technology.
He and his assistant, a guy named Charles Sumner Tainter, they invented this thing in 1880. Now think about that for a second. That's just 4 years after he got the famous patent for the telephone. His mind was already taking this giant leap into the future, moving from wires to wireless.
So how on earth did it work? Well, the process was surprisingly brilliant and simple. You'd speak into a transmitter, and the sound waves from your voice would make a tiny, super thin mirror vibrate. That vibrating mirror would then shape or modulate a beam of sunlight that was aimed at it. So your voice was literally being imprinted onto a beam of light. That light beam would travel through the air to a receiver, where a special cell would convert those light flickers back into sound. Incredible.
The secret sauce that made that receiver work was a scientific principle called photoconductivity. Bell used a cell made of selenium, which has this really cool property. Its electrical resistance changes depending on how much light is hitting it. So as that modulated beam of sunlight hit the selenium cell, it created a fluctuating electrical current that was a perfect copy of the original sound. It was just genius.
And this wasn't just some little experiment on a lab bench. On April 1st, 1880, Bell's team successfully sent a voice message over 213 meters. That's more than 2 football fields long, from the roof of one building to another. This was the world's very first wireless voice transmission.
And here's where your jaw should hit the floor. The basic idea behind the photophone, sending information on a beam of light, is the exact same principle that powers the fiber optic internet we use today. The only real difference is that we use focused lasers instead of sunlight, and we send them down glass cables instead of through the open air.
Let that sink in. Alexander Graham Bell essentially invented optical communications. The only reason the photophone was a commercial flop wasn't because the idea was bad. It's because he was over 100 years too early. The other pieces of the puzzle, lasers and fiber optics, they just didn't exist yet.
Bell's incredible mind wasn't just focused on these far-out, futuristic ideas. He also applied his genius to urgent life and death problems. And this next invention was born out of a true national emergency. So in July of 1881, the country is in crisis. President James A. Garfield has been shot. The doctors can't find the bullet, and he's slowly dying from infection. When Bell hears about this, he drops everything. He works like a madman all summer to invent an electrical probe, basically an early metal detector, to find that bullet and save the president's life. But it was too late. Garfield died that September, the bullet never found in time. And here's the really tragic part. The device actually worked perfectly in all his tests. But when they used it on the president, it just gave off a constant hum. Why? It's now believed the metal bed springs inside Garfield's mattress were causing interference. It's a factor that was completely unknown to Bell and his team. He was so close to saving a president's life.
And his work in the medical field didn't end there. He also came up with something called a vacuum jacket. It was this device designed to help with artificial breathing, and it was a direct forerunner to the iron lung, which, as you know, went on to save thousands of lives during the polio epidemics. You'd think that would be enough for one lifetime, but even in his later years, Bell's curiosity just wouldn't quit. He turned his attention from sound and electricity to trying to conquer the air and the water. The man's inventive spirit just never rested. He got totally obsessed with flight, designing and building these massive, complex kites based on tetrahedral shapes, which actually contributed to early aviation research. And at the same time, he was diving into marine engineering. He developed hydrofoils. These are boats that use underwater wings to lift up and basically fly across the water at incredible speeds.
So you have light beams, metal detectors, giant kites, super fast boats. His work was all over the place. But there was one central, deeply personal mission that was the driving force behind almost all of it, especially his most famous work on the nature of sound. And understanding this mission really changes how you see his whole career. It reveals the true calling behind the legendary inventor, a motivation that was way more important to him than any fame or fortune.
It all comes down to something called visible speech. This was a system of written symbols for sounds, a kind of phonetic alphabet that was developed by Bell's own father. And its purpose was to teach deaf people how to form words and speak clearly. You see, Bell's mother was deaf, and so was his wife. This was his life's passion.
And that brings us to the biggest reveal of all. The telephone was basically a side project. Bell's deep dive into acoustics, his experiments with vibrating membranes and electrical currents, all of that groundbreaking research that led to the telephone was originally done for one reason: to help the deaf communicate. The invention that changed the world was born from his quest to help the people he loved the most.
When we think about the invention of photography, our minds usually jump to the technology, right? The chemicals, the lenses, the light. But what if we looked at it as a social revolution? Because believe it or not, long before we had news feeds and curated profiles, there was something surprisingly similar, something that actually paved the way for the world we live in today.
So let me just start with this question. What if social media was invented in the 1860s? I know it sounds like a wild idea, but the story of early photography, well, it shows that our deep-seated need to capture our lives, curate them, and share them is not new at all. Not by a long shot.
The parallels here are just striking, aren't they?
I mean, our Instagram feeds are really just the modern version of their photo albums. We follow influencers, they collected pictures of royalty. We spend all this time carefully curating our online profiles, they were just as meticulous posing in photography studios. The tech couldn't be more different, but that human impulse, it's exactly the same.
Okay, to really get how radical this all was, we have to rewind to a time before photography. Before 1839, the only way to capture your own image was to have an artist paint it. That meant it was expensive, super exclusive, and always, always one of a kind.
And then, boom, along comes this invention, the daguerreotype. When it was introduced in 1839, it must have felt like pure magic. For the very first time, you could capture reality itself on a silver-coated copper plate with this incredible, mind-blowing detail. But, and this is a big but, it had some pretty serious limitations.
Yeah, you can see why this wasn't about to take over the world. The process was a genuine ordeal. We're talking hazardous chemicals like toxic iodine and heated mercury fumes, and the exposure times, they were minutes long. Subjects had to be physically held still in clamps to avoid blurring. Not exactly a casual selfie, right?
And here's the real kicker, the most critical limitation. Each daguerreotype was a direct positive image. There was no negative. That meant you got one image, one chance to get it right, and absolutely no copies. It was a precious, unique object for sure, but it wasn't shareable. You couldn't just pass it around. So that brings us to the real game changer, the innovation that took photography from this artisanal craft and turned it into a mass medium. I'm talking about the invention of the negative, and with it, the incredible power of the copy.
In 1851, the wet plate process came along and changed everything. Suddenly, you had reproducibility. You could make unlimited prints from a single glass negative. Exposure times dropped from long, agonizing minutes to just a few seconds. And instead of one fragile metal plate, you now had a negative and as many paper prints as you wanted. This was the leap that made photography social.
And once that happened, things started moving fast. I mean really fast. You've got the daguerreotype in 39, the wet plate process just 12 years later in 51, and then only 3 years after that, a whole new format was patented that would set off a social explosion. This is the moment photography goes viral, 19th century style. Because the new process was so much cheaper and you could make copies, it led to this phenomenon that the Victorians themselves called cartomania.
And the engine for this craze was something called the carte de visite, or CDV for short. It was just a small photo mounted on a card, but the genius of its inventor, a guy named André Desdery, was in the production. He used a special camera with multiple lenses to print 8 portraits on a single negative, which just massively slashed the cost of each photo. The scale of this craze is just, well, it's breathtaking. In just 6 years, over 300 million of these little cards were sold in England alone. This wasn't just a popular product, it was a full-blown cultural obsession. CDVs became what one writer called the social currency of the mid-Victorian era. And that's exactly what they were. People didn't just buy them for themselves. They collected them, they traded them, and they put them in these elaborate albums that they'd display in their parlors for everyone to see. It was their version of a public profile, a curated gallery of their social network.
So you see, this wasn't just about collecting pictures. This was about building an identity, crafting a persona, and sharing it with your network. This was, for all intents and purposes, history's very first social media.
Just think of the carte de visite as their profile picture. Every single detail was intentional. People would pose in studios with props that were chosen to send a message, a book to show you're intelligent, a fancy column to suggest you're wealthy, a globe to imply you're worldly. It was a constructed, idealized version of yourself, which you then shared with your network. And this wasn't just for friends and family. It became the first time celebrity images were mass-produced and distributed.
And that gave rise to the very first celebrity influencers. You know who was a huge fan of this format? Queen Victoria. By allowing CDVs to be made of her and her family, often in these surprisingly casual domestic scenes, she totally humanized the monarchy. Suddenly, anybody could own a picture of the Queen. Her image became a commodity you could buy in a shop, creating this feeling of a personal connection to the most famous person on the planet.
But maybe the most profound impact of all was this. The technology democratized identity itself. For the first time in history, you didn't have to be a noble or a king to have your portrait made.
The growing middle class could now finally afford to have their likeness preserved and, even more importantly, shared with others.
So when you trace this whole story, from a single precious metal plate to millions of shareable cards, one thing becomes incredibly clear. The technology we use is always changing, but the human desires that drive us, they're remarkably consistent.
That formal, stiff studio portrait from the 19th century? It was the original selfie. Sure, the tools were clunky and the process was slow, but the impulse behind it was identical to ours today. To document yourself, craft an image of who you want to be, and share it with your world. All right, let's talk about something huge, something invisible that's running literally everything around us. We're going to dive into that force and the incredible mind that figured out how to control it.
No, seriously, just take a second. The lights in your room, the screen you're looking at right now, heck, the entire city you live in. It's all powered by something you can't see or touch or even smell. It's wild when you think about it. And the story of how we managed to tame this invisible giant, it's just amazing.
Okay, so let's get into it. To really understand this, we need to travel back in time. We're heading to the Victorian era. You know, the age we usually think of as all smoke, gears, and brute force.
And this is such a cool way to look at it. On the one hand, you have the really obvious stuff: steam engines, massive steel structures, the things you could see and feel. But bubbling just beneath the surface was a totally different kind of revolution, an invisible one. It wasn't about engines. It was about the very nature of energy.
So, who was leading this charge? You might think it was some wealthy lord or a stuffy university professor, right? Nope. At the very heart of this was a total underdog, a guy who came from practically nothing and would go on to change, well, everything. And his name was Michael Faraday.
I mean, get this. He was the son of a blacksmith. He was almost completely self-taught, just devouring books. He eventually landed a job at the prestigious Royal Institution, and that's where his real genius shone. He took this thing called electricity, which at the time was basically just a cool party trick, a scientific oddity, and figured out how to make it a reliable, manageable, and world-altering force.
Now, for a long time, scientists had a hunch. They knew electricity and magnetism were somehow connected, like two sides of the same coin. But nobody could figure out how. They couldn't crack the code. Faraday, he became obsessed with it, and that obsession led him to what is arguably the single most important discovery we're going to talk about.
The year is 1831. Just lock that in your mind, because this is it. This is the moment the world pivots. After countless failed attempts, Faraday sets up this one simple, almost beautiful experiment, and he finally unlocks the secret.
Okay, so look at how he did this. It's so clever. He takes this iron ring and wraps two completely separate coils of wire around it. Then, he connects one of those coils to a battery, and for just a split second, he sees a little jolt of current in the other coil, the one that wasn't connected to anything. And that's when it hit him, the big aha moment. It wasn't the magnetic field itself that was doing it, it was the change, the switching on and off of that field. That was the magic ingredient.
And just like that, he discovered it: electromagnetic induction. It sounds complicated, but the core idea is stunningly simple. If you have a changing magnetic field near a wire, you create an electric current. That's it. That one principle is the foundation for pretty much every bit of electricity we use on the planet today. No exaggeration.
And here's where it gets even more elegant. It's a two-way street. If you spin a magnet inside a coil of wire, that's mechanical motion. You get electricity. That's a generator. But flip it around. Put electricity into the wire and it makes the magnet spin. That's a motor. How cool is that? One discovery unlocks both creating power and using it to do work.
But you know what's maybe even more incredible than the experiment itself was how Faraday pictured what was happening in his mind. This wasn't just about tinkering in a lab. This was a whole new way of seeing the universe.
See, Faraday wasn't a trained mathematician. He didn't think in pages of complicated equations. He was a visual thinker. So to understand this invisible force, he just imagined it. He pictured these invisible lines of force coming out of a magnet, filling the space all around it, like invisible roads that energy could travel on.
And that simple mental picture, that gave birth to one of the biggest ideas in all of physics: field theory. The idea that forces and energy don't just exist in an object, but in the empty space all around it. It was completely revolutionary. It changed everything, and it was later put into the language of math by the brilliant James Clerk Maxwell.
What's funny is, Faraday himself wasn't really thinking about making money or inventing gadgets.
He was all about the pure science, the discovery. There's this great story where the Prime Minister supposedly asked him, "Well, what's the use of all this?" And Faraday's legendary comeback was, "Why, sir, one day you may tax it." He knew. He could already see that he hadn't just found a scientific principle, he'd unleashed a future economic powerhouse.
And man, was he right. It didn't happen overnight, but that little discovery made on a lab bench in London, it was about to change the world forever.
So you can see here, it was kind of a slow burn at first. After that big discovery in 1831, it actually took a few decades for engineers to figure out how to scale it up, to make it big and powerful. But once they perfected the dynamo generator in the late 1800s, boom, the electric revolution didn't just start, it exploded.
All of a sudden, we could make huge amounts of cheap electricity. We weren't stuck with these weak, expensive little chemical batteries anymore. This is what made things like the electric light bulb actually practical for guys like Edison. It's what powered the first electric streetcars that completely changed our cities. Faraday's discovery took electricity from being this electric fluid, this lab curiosity, and turned it into a commodity, something you could make, send down a wire, and sell. It literally lit up the modern world.
You know, we tend to think our super-connected world is, well, brand new. But what if I told you the blueprint for our entire digital age was drawn up way back in the 19th century? It all started with a technology that feels almost ancient to us now, the electric telegraph. And let me tell you, this network of wires did so much more than just speed things up. It literally rewired society itself. Okay, so for pretty much all of human history, right up until the 1830s, there was this hard speed limit on communication. And what was it? Well, it was the speed of a horse, or a train, or a ship. A message could only go as fast as something could physically carry it. But then came the telegraph, and it just shattered that limit. For the very first time, information was untethered from transportation. And that right there changed absolutely everything.
So you have this brand new instant communication. How exactly does it start to reshape the world? Well, for starters, it completely transformed global business. And it also became this incredibly powerful tool for building empires.
You know what's so cool about this? It's the metaphor the Victorians themselves came up with. They saw it like this. If the railways were the arteries of the empire, moving goods and people around, then the telegraph, that was the nervous system. It was all about moving information. And this nervous system allowed a central brain, say London, to send out commands and get feedback from its most distant parts, well, pretty much instantly.
And here's a perfect example of just how important that nervous system was strategically. It was called the All-Red Route, a massive web of underwater cables connecting the entire British Empire. Now, the genius part, the really crucial part, was that these cables never passed through foreign territory. This meant all their military and political messages stayed completely secure. It was, in effect, a tool of control, a literal web holding a global empire together. And it wasn't just about politics and military. This nervous system completely turned the global economy on its head. Think about it. Before the telegraph, trade was based on information that was weeks, sometimes months old. But then, in 1866, the first permanent transatlantic cable goes live and boom, everything syncs up. All of a sudden, the price of cotton in New York could change the price in London in real time. This was it. This was the moment our modern global financial system was actually born.
But the changes weren't just in the markets. The telegraph also had this dramatic and honestly pretty traumatic impact on warfare. It dragged the brutal reality of the battlefield right into the public's living room, with a speed and intensity that nobody, and I mean nobody, was ready for.
24 hours. Just think about that number for a second. During the Crimean War in the 1850s, a new submarine cable cut the communication time between the government in London and their commanders on the front lines from weeks down to just 24 hours. That's it. Suddenly, war wasn't some far-off event you read about a month later, it was happening right now.
And this incredible new speed created this completely new feedback loop. And for the military command, it was a nightmare. Here's how it worked. You had war correspondents on the front lines telegraphing back stories about incompetent leaders and the awful conditions the soldiers were in. Of course, this reporting sparks public outrage back home. That outrage puts huge pressure on the politicians. And what do the politicians do? They grab the telegraph and start micromanaging their generals from hundreds of miles away. I mean, you can just feel the sheer frustration in this quote from General Sir James Simpson. The confounded telegraph has ruined everything. For guys like him,
The telegraph wasn't progress, it was a curse. It totally stripped them of their autonomy. They couldn't just make decisions based on what was happening on the ground anymore. Nope. Now they were basically on a leash, tethered to politicians who were just reacting to the latest news headlines.
So, what's the big takeaway here? It's this massive political shift. For the very first time in history, war basically became a spectator sport. The public could follow along almost in real time. And because of that, leaders and the military were suddenly facing this new kind of democratic oversight happening as the events unfolded.
Okay, so we've talked about empires and battlefields, but let's shift gears, because the telegraph was also creating something, well, a lot more personal. It was fostering entirely new kinds of social connections. In fact, you could say it gave birth to the world's very first online communities.
This is one of my favorite details. It's so cool. See, telegraph operators didn't just mechanically tap out Morse code. Every single one of them had a unique style, a personal rhythm. It was called their fist. And this fist acted like a personal signature. A really skilled operator could actually recognize who was on the other end of the line, miles and miles away, just from their tapping style, even if they'd never met in person. Isn't that amazing?
And when you start looking, the parallels to our own internet age are just uncanny. I mean, think about it. The telegraph office, that was basically the first chat room. An operator's fist, that's their handle, their username. People were finding love on the wires. They called it wired love, which is pretty much Victorian online dating. And get this, people were even faking their identities, playing around with the anonymity of it all. It was the 19th century version of catfishing and trolling.
And these kinds of long-distance, disembodied relationships became so popular that it actually created a whole new genre of novels and stories. They called it wired love. It just completely captured the public's imagination. This idea that you could fall for someone, have this deep emotional connection with a person you only knew as a pattern of clicks coming down a wire.
So when you pull it all together, this is what the Victorians really felt they had done. They used this phrase, an annihilation of time and space. And it makes sense, right? Whether it was running an empire, managing a war, or even falling in love, the telegraph felt like this incredible force that was just erasing distance and time. It shrunk the globe and created that feeling of instant connection that, honestly, we just take for granted today.
Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs in history don't come from a brilliant plan. They come from a complete and total mistake. We're about to dive into one of the greatest, most world-changing accidents of all time. Okay, that sounds like a bit of a trick question, right? A piece of high fashion from the 1800s and a common painkiller you probably have at home right now. What in the world could they have in common? Well, the answer is not just real, it's an incredible story about how one failed experiment literally changed everything. All right, so let's get into it. Our story starts not in some fancy high-tech lab, but in a small, homemade one, with an experiment that went completely, spectacularly wrong. Picture this. It's 1856. Our hero isn't some world-renowned scientist. Nope. He's an 18-year-old chemistry student, a kid named William Henry Perkin. And he decides to spend his Easter break trying to tackle one of the biggest medical crises on the planet. No big deal, right? See, Perkin had this incredibly ambitious goal. He wanted to create a synthetic version of quinine. Back then, quinine was the only thing that worked against malaria, but it was super expensive and difficult to get. Making it in a lab? That could save millions of lives. So Perkin gets to work. He's messing around with aniline, which comes from coal tar. And you gotta understand, coal tar was basically just nasty industrial waste. But his experiment was a total bust. He didn't get quinine. All he got was this thick, black, useless sludge. A total dead end. Or so it seemed. So, probably pretty frustrated, Perkin starts to clean up his mess. But when he pours alcohol into the flask to wash out all that gunk, something amazing happens. The black sludge dissolves, and the liquid turns this stunning, brilliant shade of purple. He had absolutely no idea what he'd made, but he knew it was something special. So Perkin totally failed to make a cure for malaria, but he accidentally discovered a color. And believe me, that color was about to take the world by storm. You have to remember, before this, purple was the ultimate status symbol. It was for emperors and kings. To get it, you had to crush thousands of tiny sea snails. It was just absurdly expensive. But Perkin's new color, he called it mauveine, could be made from cheap, dirty coal tar. He basically took the color of royalty and made it available to everyone.
And people went absolutely nuts for it. Just 2 years after he discovered it, Queen Victoria herself wore a mauve gown. And once the queen does something, it's a done deal. The trend exploded. It became so popular, people started calling it the mauve measles, because it was just everywhere.
But here's where the story gets so much bigger than just a fashion trend. Perkins' lucky mistake didn't just create a color, it created the blueprint for an entire industry. See, Perkin wasn't just a brilliant chemist, he was a pretty sharp entrepreneur too. He immediately patented his process, opened up his own factory, and became incredibly wealthy by turning worthless industrial gunk into one of the hottest products on Earth. And this just set off a chain reaction. Perkin proved that you could engineer valuable, complex things from simple raw materials. This was the birth of the entire synthetic chemical industry. In fact, huge companies you know today, like Bayer and BASF, actually got their start as dye manufacturers, all thanks to Perkins' work.
Okay, now hold on, because this is where the story takes a wild and unexpected turn. Scientists at these new dye companies started playing around with their creations, and they noticed something really odd. The thought process that followed is just genius. So first, you have these dyes for coloring clothes. Then biologists realize, hey, we can use these to stain cells to see them better under a microscope. But while they're doing that, they see something incredible. Certain dyes would stick to only the bacteria and then kill them, leaving all the other cells alone. That was the light bulb moment. What if you could design a molecule to do that on purpose inside the human body? And that idea led directly to one of the most important concepts in all of modern medicine, the magic bullet. The whole idea, championed by a scientist named Paul Ehrlich, was to create a drug that would hunt down and destroy one specific germ, just like a dye sticks to one specific type of fabric, without hurting the patient. The entire field of chemotherapy was basically born from the science of coloring t-shirts. And this brings us right back to that question from the beginning. That aspirin in your medicine cabinet? Yeah, its family tree has a very, very purple root. You can literally draw a straight line. Bayer, starting as a dye company, used its mastery of coal tar chemistry to create aspirin. Paul Ehrlich used that exact same chemistry to develop Salvarsan, the first real magic bullet drug against syphilis. And even the first antibiotics, the sulfa drugs, were developed directly from chemical dyes. It sounds crazy, but it's true. The whole modern pharmaceutical industry, all of it, was built on the foundation laid by an 18-year-old kid who was just trying to clean up a failed experiment. For most of human history, one of our biggest fears wasn't just death. It was the incredible pain that often came before it. So today, we're going to get into the story of how we finally conquered physical pain. And trust me, this is about way more than just medicine. This is about a revolution that completely changed what it means to be human. So let's just start with a question, and it's a pretty intense one. Do you think you could survive surgery in the 19th century? I mean, really think about it. Before the 1840s, the operating room was a place of just pure terror. There was absolutely no way to stop the pain. The only thing that mattered was how much you could possibly endure. The reality was just brutal. Surgery was this desperate, last-ditch effort. Patients would be held down, fully awake, fully conscious, while surgeons worked as fast as humanly possible. The best surgeon wasn't the most careful or the most precise. No, they were the fastest. An amputation might take just a few seconds, because that was all a person could possibly take before going into shock. All right, so here's the path we're going to take. We'll start in what I'm calling the Age of Agony. Then we'll see how a weird discovery at a dinner party changed everything. We'll unpack the controversy that followed, see how the Queen of England got involved, and finally look at how it kicked off a whole new era for medicine. To really truly get why this was such a game changer, we have to understand just how bad things were. So let's go back in time to a world without any pain relief. Let's step into the Age of Agony. So before anesthesia, surgery wasn't really a science. It was more like this crude, frantic art. It's often described as being performed on a conscious, writhing patient. Just imagine that. Your survival had less to do with how good your surgeon was and more to do with your own sheer ability to withstand unbelievable amounts of pain. For centuries, this was just how it was. But then, in the 1840s, things started to change, and fast. And the discovery of one of the most important chemicals in history, well,
it didn't happen in some sterile, high-tech lab. Nope, it happened in a dining room in Edinburgh, Scotland.
So the stage was already being set, right? In 1846, ether was introduced as an anesthetic, which was a huge step for sure. But it had some pretty big problems. It was super flammable, it smelled terrible, and it had some nasty side effects. A Scottish doctor named Sir James Young Simpson was positive there had to be something better out there.
And the way he found it, oh man, it is the stuff of legend. This was not careful, by-the-book research. This was a moment of pure, reckless, and maybe slightly insane Victorian curiosity. It was brave, it was probably a little foolish, but it absolutely changed the world.
Okay, so get this story. Simpson and a couple of his doctor friends are literally sitting around after dinner, and they just decide to start inhaling a bunch of different chemicals to see what would happen. You know, as you do. They get to this heavy, sweet-smelling liquid, chloroform. They each take a good sniff, and boom, they all pass out and collapse under the table. When they wake up on the floor a little while later, Simpson has this huge aha moment. He'd found it. Something way stronger and way more pleasant than ether.
So you'd think, right? Incredible discovery, problem solved, the world rejoices. But that's not what happened at all. Turns out, the battle to conquer pain wasn't just about science. It was about culture and tradition.
The opposition basically came from two very different sides. On one hand, you had religious traditionalists who argued that pain, especially the pain of childbirth, was God's will. They would literally cite scripture. On the other hand, you had some medical conservatives who were worried about the real-world dangers. Could this stuff actually slow down labor? Could it be dangerous for the baby? These were serious concerns. So this huge debate just kept raging on. It was going to take someone really powerful, a really respected public figure, to cut through all that noise and finally settle the argument for good.
And the year everything changed was 1853. This is the year that science gets a very, very powerful ally, and the fate of anesthesia is sealed forever.
While giving birth to her 8th child, Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria, the Queen of England, made a pretty bold request. She wanted pain relief. So the famous Dr. John Snow was called to the palace, and he personally gave the Queen chloroform. And the Queen's reaction wasn't just, oh, that was nice. She raved about it. In her own private journal, she called it that blessed chloroform, delightful beyond measure. I mean, that was it. Game over. That royal seal of approval completely changed public opinion. If it was good enough and safe enough for the Queen, well, it was safe enough for everybody.
So, with the debate finally put to rest and anesthesia becoming normal, the real revolution could finally begin. Medicine was about to take a quantum leap forward.
The change was, well, it was night and day. Surgery transformed from a frantic race against the clock into a precise, careful science. For the first time, surgeons could actually take their time. They could focus on precision, and they could start doing complex internal surgeries that were completely unimaginable just a few years earlier.
So why does all this matter? The Queen's decision was this huge moment where the establishment, the monarchy, sided with scientific progress over tradition and dogma. That stamp of approval gave medicine the green light it needed to evolve into the incredible, life-saving fields we know today.
All right, let's get right into it. We're about to dive into the story of a scientific revolution that literally changed the world. It's a war story, really, but the enemy wasn't some visible army. It was an invisible force that had been humanity's #1 killer for, well, forever.
So, just imagine this. For most history, when a terrifying plague swept through your town, the biggest question was simply, why? Was it a curse from the gods? Something evil in the soil? Or maybe, just maybe, it was something in the very air you were breathing. This was the central mystery, and the answer people landed on for centuries was, surprisingly simple and catastrophically wrong. The idea that ruled the day was called miasma theory. The thinking went like this. Diseases were caused by bad air, nasty vapors that came from rotting stuff. If it smelled foul, it could make you sick. I mean, it kind of makes sense, right? But this one belief, as logical as it seemed, was a massive wall standing in the way of any real understanding of disease. So our first hero in this story, the guy who starts to tear down that wall, he isn't even a doctor. He's a French chemist named Louis Pasteur. And his journey to understand the world of the living started, weirdly enough, by studying the non-living geometry of crystals. This unique background gave him a kind of superpower. It let him see what everyone else was missing.
And believe it or not, it all began with wine. Pasteur was studying tartaric acid, a substance left over from winemaking. He looked at its crystals under a microscope and noticed something incredible. Crystals that came from living things were different from ones cooked up in a lab. They had a handedness, kind of like your left and right hand are mirror images of each other. After painstakingly separating these tiny crystals, he had this huge aha moment. This unique asymmetry, he realized, was the actual signature of life itself.
And this whole experience just perfectly illustrates his famous quote. All that meticulous work he'd done in chemistry and physics had prepared his mind, so when he started looking into things like why beer and wine spoiled, he wasn't just seeing a simple chemical reaction, he was ready to see the hidden hand of biology at work.
All that preparation led to his absolute masterstroke. For 2,000 years, a lot of people believed in spontaneous generation, the idea that life could just pop out of nowhere. Pasteur thought this was ridiculous, and he set out to disprove it with this brilliant and beautiful experiment. He took some broth, boiled it to kill anything alive in it, and put it in this special swan neck flask. Now the cool thing is, air could still get in, but the S-shaped curve trapped any dust particles and the microbes hitching a ride on them. And guess what happened? Nothing. The broth stayed perfectly clear. But then, and here's the kicker, he tipped the flask just enough for the broth to touch that trapped dust. And bam, the liquid almost instantly exploded with life. He proved once and for all that microbes came from other microbes. They didn't just appear out of thin air.
Okay, so Pasteur proved these tiny organisms are everywhere, but that left a huge question unanswered. Which of them are the actual killers? Which ones cause disease? Well, that required a completely different kind of mind, and that's where Robert Koch, a German doctor, steps onto the scene. He would become the ultimate germ hunter, turning Pasteur's big idea into a rigorous, killer-catching science.
And these two men could not have been more different. If Pasteur was the artist, the visionary chemist painting the big picture, Koch was the detective, the methodical physician focused on the gritty details. He wasn't interested in broad strokes, he wanted cold, hard proof. He was the one who developed the forensic methods you'd need to convict one specific microbe for one specific crime.
His first big case was anthrax, a terrifying disease that was just wiping out livestock. Now, he didn't just find the little rod-shaped bacteria in the blood of sick animals. He went way further. He watched them, mapping out their entire life cycle. And in the process, he discovered they could form these incredibly tough survival pods called spores. And that discovery finally solved the ancient mystery of cursed fields. Pastures where healthy animals would graze and then suddenly drop dead for no apparent reason. The spores were just lying in wait in the soil.
And to make all of this real, repeatable science, he created a set of rules, basically a foolproof checklist for convicting a microbial killer. We call them Koch's postulates, and they became the gold standard. It's super logical. First, the microbe has to be in every sick animal, but not in healthy ones. Second, you have to isolate it and grow it all by itself in a pure culture. Third, if you introduce that pure microbe to a healthy host, it has to cause the same disease. And finally, the clincher, you have to be able to pull that exact same microbe out of the new victim. It was a rigorous system that germ hunting from a guessing game into a hard science.
So you'd think, with that kind of evidence, case closed, right? Everyone accepts the new germ theory? But not so fast. Big ideas rarely get a quiet welcome. This was an all-out intellectual war, and it led to one of the most dramatic and frankly dangerous moments in the entire history of science.
The main skeptic was a very powerful scientist named Max von Pettenkofer. He was a champion of a modified miasma theory. He basically said, okay, fine, Koch, your little germs might exist, but they're harmless on their own. He believed that a germ needed the right soil condition, the right environment, to actually become deadly.
So to prove Koch wrong once and for all, Pettenkofer did something absolutely insane. In 1892, he asked Koch's lab to send him a fresh, virulent sample of the bacteria that causes cholera. On October 7th, in front of a group of witnesses, he took some baking soda to neutralize his stomach acid. He knew it was a key defense. And then he drank the entire vial, a broth teeming with billions of live cholera bacteria. And then everyone just waited. Incredibly, days later, he was fine. He'd had some mild diarrhea, but that was it. He survived.
He survived a dose that should have killed him 10 times over. I mean, think about that for a second. Did this just prove Koch wrong? Was the germ theory fatally flawed? For a moment, the scientific world was just thrown into chaos.
And you can bet Pettenkofer was claiming a massive victory.
But scientific truths aren't settled by a single dramatic stunt, no matter how wild it is. The final verdict, the one that really mattered, wasn't going to be delivered in a lab. It was going to be delivered on the streets of a major city, in the middle of a catastrophe.
That same year, 1892, a terrible cholera epidemic slammed into the city of Hamburg. It became the ultimate, tragic real-world test. Pettenkofer's ideas about the soil and the environment, following his advice, did absolutely nothing to stop the outbreak. But Koch's advice, based on his simple germ theory, it was direct and powerful. Cholera spreads through contaminated water. Boil your water. And in the areas where people listened, the epidemic was contained. The debate was over.
And the victory of that one idea changed our world in ways we can't even imagine. It's the reason we have clean water and modern sewage systems. It's why we pasteurize milk. It's the reason surgeons scrub their hands and use sterile instruments. It gave us vaccines for diseases like rabies. So much of what we just call modern medicine is built directly on the foundation that these pioneers laid.
Today, we're going to talk about a handful of inventions from the 19th century that did more than just change the world. They, in a way, changed what it even means to be human. We're talking about technology that basically gave us superhuman senses, letting us hear, see, and even look right through things that were completely invisible before.
Okay, so let's set the stage. If you were a doctor back in the early 1800s, the human body was, for all intents and purposes, a black box. Your entire diagnosis depended on what you could see, what you could feel, or what you could hear, just with your own senses. The real challenge was figuring out how to get inside that box without cutting it open, how to listen, to magnify, and to penetrate this totally hidden world. So our first story kicks off with a really simple but deep problem. How does a doctor actually hear the super subtle sounds of life and disease that are happening inside a patient's chest? The answer to that would not only end up saving lives, but it would change the whole dynamic between a doctor and their patient forever.
Yeah, believe it or not, before 1816, the best thing a doctor could do was something called immediate auscultation, which is really just a fancy way of saying they'd literally put their ear right on a patient's chest. I mean, you can imagine how awkward that was, not to mention unhygienic. And a lot of the time, it was pretty useless, especially if the patient was carrying a little extra weight. So the breakthrough, it didn't come from some complex theory or a fancy lab. It actually came from a really simple observation. A French doctor, René Laennec, saw some kids playing. They were tapping on one end of a big wooden beam, and their friends were listening at the other end. And he had this light bulb moment. A solid object could carry and amplify sound way better than just air could. And so, in 1816, when he was with a patient and needed to listen in, inspiration struck. He grabbed a notebook, rolled it up into a tube, put it on her chest, and listened. The sounds were crystal clear, just astonishingly clear. He'd found a way to bridge that physical gap. And really soon after, that rolled-up paper evolved into the very first stethoscope, a simple, elegant, hollow cylinder made of wood.
And this is how a great idea takes off, right? It just keeps getting better. Pretty soon, flexible tubes were added, just to make it easier to use. Then came a binaural design. That just means one for each ear, which, as you can imagine, made the sound quality way better. By the end of the century, the stethoscope looked a lot like the one we all recognize today, a tool that was both intimate and totally professional.
All right, so we've conquered sound. Next up, sight. The next huge challenge was to see this whole other universe that was hiding in a single drop of water, this world of the infinitesimally small.
For most of the 19th century, making a really good microscope lens was, it was more of an art than a science. It was all based on a craftsman's gut feeling, a lot of trial and error, and the results were just frustratingly inconsistent. To really unlock that microscopic world, lens making had to stop being a craft and start being a predictable science.
And this partnership was the absolute turning point. So in 1866, you have this brilliant mechanic, Carl Zeiss, and he hires a physicist, Ernst Abbe, and he gives him just one mission: figure out the math behind the perfect lens. This collaboration was going to change science forever.
Now, Abbe's biggest enemy was this really pesky optical problem called chromatic aberration. You know that weird color fringing you sometimes see in pictures, that little rainbow halo that makes everything blurry? That's basically it. If he was going to see tiny bacteria clearly, he had to get rid of that distortion.
So, absolution was just a masterpiece of innovation. It wasn't just one thing. He came up with new mathematical theories, he teamed up with a chemist named Otto Schott to create totally new kinds of glass, he designed these lenses that could correct for 3 different colors of light at once, and he even used a special oil to sharpen the resolution. It was the whole package. And here's why all that hard work really mattered. This new level of clarity wasn't just for fun. It allowed scientists like Robert Koch to finally, for the very first time, see and identify the tiny bacteria that were causing horrible diseases like tuberculosis. They were making the invisible agents of death visible. Okay, so we've listened to the body's inner workings, we've seen the germs that attack it, but the final leap, well, this one was the most science fiction of them all. The power to look right through skin and muscle without making a single cut. What's wild is that unlike germ theory, which people argued about for years, the X-ray was an instant hit. The proof was just undeniable. You could see it with your own eyes. Wilhelm Röntgen discovers it in his lab in November 1895. By February of the very next year, it's already being used in a hospital. And by 1898, it's saving lives on the battlefield. The adoption was just breathtakingly fast. And its impact in wartime was immediate and massive. I mean, think about it. Before X-rays, if a soldier was shot, finding the bullet meant a surgeon had to just poke around inside the wound with unsterilized tools. It was a practice that very often led to deadly infections. Now, surgeons could see exactly where the shrapnel was, saving countless lives by preventing sepsis. So this new power to see the unseen, it just seemed like a pure miracle, right? No downsides. But this incredible new light came with a terrible hidden cost that absolutely no one saw coming.
Okay, I want you to imagine our digital world, but not with silicon and screens. No, I'm talking about brass gears and steam power. You see, long before the very first microchip was even a dream, the entire blueprint for the modern computer was actually conceived in Victorian England. This is the wild story of that machine, an engine of thought, born a full century before its time.
And it all starts, as so many great things do, with a moment of pure, utter frustration. The year is 1821. The brilliant inventor Charles Babbage is just fed up. He's looking at these astronomical tables, and they are just riddled with mistakes. And that's when he says it. I wish to God these calculations had been executed by steam. Now, this wasn't just some throwaway comment. It was the spark that was about to ignite a revolution.
So here's how we're going to trace this journey. We'll start with Babbage's audacious dream of calculations executed by steam, and then we'll see the harsh reality of a grand, unfinished machine. But out of that failure, we'll see the concept of the first universal computer rise up. We'll meet the poet of science who really understood what it all meant. And finally, we'll see how it all became a blueprint for today.
Right, so what was this problem? What could possibly drive a genius to wish that math could be done by a steam engine? Well, it all boiled down to one single pervasive flaw in the system: good old-fashioned human error.
You have to remember, back in the early 19th century, the British Empire was a global machine, and the fuel for that machine was data. Every ship's captain navigating the globe, every astronomer charting the stars, every banker, they all relied on these huge books of mathematical tables. A single mistake in those tables, that could mean a ship vanishing at sea, or a total financial disaster. The stakes were just incredibly high.
So who was making these super important tables? Get this, it was an army of clerks. They literally called human computers. And their job, day in and day out, was to do endless, mind-numbing calculations by hand. And yeah, they were smart, but they were also human. You know, they'd get tired, they'd get distracted, and they would make mistakes. It was inevitable.
Babbage's idea to fix this was just brilliant. He designed something called the difference engine, and it was designed to solve 2 problems at once. Not only would it automate the calculations, getting them perfect every time, but it would also physically stamp the answers onto printing plates. That way, you'd eliminate human error from the entire process, start to finish.
The cleverness was all in the mechanics. See, the engine could figure out these complex functions using a mathematical trick that only needed simple addition and subtraction, which are way easier to build with gears and cogs. Then, once it had the answer, it would literally press the numbers into soft metal, creating a perfect mold for the printing press. No human hands, no human error. Genius! So, it was an amazing idea. Babbage even got the government to back him, and he started building. But this is where our story takes a very dramatic and very, very
expensive turn.
The British government poured over £17,000 into this project. I mean, you have to understand, that was an absolutely astronomical amount of money back then. Just let that number sink in for a second. To put that into perspective for you, for the same amount of cash, the government could have bought 22 brand new, state-of-the-art steam locomotives, the very symbols of power and progress in that era.
And after all that time, all that money, all that effort, what was the result? Nothing. The machine was never finished. I mean, a piece of it was built, and it worked perfectly, but the full, grand machine, it just never happened.
So what on earth went wrong? Well, a couple of things, really. First, Babbage had a huge falling out with his chief engineer, a guy named Joseph Clement, and that brought all the work to a screeching halt. Then, after years of delays and burning through cash with no final product to show for it, the government just lost its nerve. In 1842, the Prime Minister pulled the plug for good.
But here's the twist, and this is the most important part of the story. For Babbage, the failure of the difference engine wasn't the end. In a strange way, it was a liberation. Because freed from the constraints of that first project, he started thinking about something way bigger, something infinitely more ambitious.
Okay, so check out the difference here. The first machine, the difference engine, that was a specialized calculator. It was built to do one thing really, really well. But this new idea, the analytical engine, that was a true general-purpose computer. It could be programmed to do any kind of calculation you could think of. This was a massive, massive leap forward.
And the design for this thing was just shockingly modern. It had a component he called the store, which could hold 1,000 different numbers, each one up to 50 digits long. This was, for all intents and purposes, the world's very first concept for computer memory, what we all call RAM today. Then there was the mill. The mill's job was to grab numbers from the store, do the math, and then put the answers back into the store. Now, if that sounds familiar, it should. That is exactly what a central processing unit, or a CPU, does in every single computer, phone, and tablet we use today.
So the big question is, how did you tell this machine what to do? Well, this is where Babbage got really clever. He borrowed an idea from the textile industry, of all places. See, jacquard looms use these cards with holes punched in them to weave incredibly complex patterns into fabric. Babbage realized he could use those same punched cards to feed his engine instructions and data. And right there, that was the birth of software.
Now, Babbage was a brilliant engineer, no doubt about it. He was the hardware guy. But it took a totally different kind of mind to really grasp the philosophical, world-changing implications of his machine. And that mind belonged to Ada Lovelace. So in 1843, Lovelace was translating an article about the engine, but she didn't more than just translate. She added her own huge set of notes, and buried in those notes was this absolutely visionary sentence. She realized this machine could go way, way beyond just crunching numbers. And this, right here, is the key insight. Lovelace understood that if you could represent anything with symbols, whether it's music or language or logic, then the machine could process it. This is the conceptual leap. This is what turns a calculator into a universal machine. It's the very soul of what a computer is. And she wasn't just theorizing about it. In her famous Note G, she wrote out a detailed step-by-step set of instructions for the engine to calculate this really complex sequence of numbers. This wasn't just a simple formula. It had loops, it had conditional branching, all the core logic of modern programming. And it is, without a doubt, the first published computer program in the history of the world.
Now, tragically, neither Babbage nor Lovelace would ever live to see the analytical engine get built. The level of precision needed to make all those gears was just beyond the technology of their time. But that doesn't take away from what they accomplished one bit.
Everything. I mean, everything. We take for granted in our digital lives today. Memory, processing, software. The very idea that a single machine can be a word processor one minute and a music player the next, it was all there, laid out in their designs and in their notes. They literally drew the complete architectural plan for our world 100 years before anyone could even lay the first brick.
All right, today we're going to dive into the story of one of the most transformative inventions you probably never, ever think about, the mechanization of cold itself. But before we get there, just take a second and imagine a world where you couldn't make something cold. A world where cold wasn't a utility, something you could create on demand, but a scarce natural resource you had to hunt down, harvest, and then try to store. For pretty much all of human history, that was the reality.
keeping food from spoiling, cooling a drink. It all hinged on this massive industry that would literally harvest ice from frozen lakes and rivers. Your ability to get something cold was completely controlled by where you lived and what season it was. It was a true tyranny of geography.
But then a few brilliant innovators came along and decided to stop harvesting the climate and start mechanizing it. And this wasn't just some new gadget. It was a fundamental triumph of applied thermodynamics.
So the key breakthrough, the real light bulb moment, comes in 1834 from an American inventor named Jacob Perkins. He created the very first vapor compression refrigeration system. The basic idea is just brilliant. It's a closed loop that uses a special volatile fluid to literally pump heat out of one area and dump it somewhere else, creating cold as a result.
And this is it, the Perkins cycle. And get this, it's pretty much the same exact principle your own fridge uses today. First, you compress a gas, which makes it super hot. Then, that hot gas cools down in a coil and condenses into a liquid. That liquid gets shot through a tiny valve, causing its pressure and temperature to plummet. And finally, that intensely cold liquid absorbs heat from its surroundings, making ice, before it boils back into a gas and the whole cycle starts over. It's just this elegant, continuous loop of heat transfer.
But here's the crazy part. Despite patenting this world-changing device, nothing happened. Seriously, for decades, it was just a scientific curiosity, completely lost in the shadow of the massive, powerful, and incredibly profitable natural ice trade.
The commercial breakthrough didn't actually happen until the 1850s, and it happened all the way over in Australia. An inventor named James Harrison was desperate to keep beer and meat from spoiling in that intense heat, so he refined Perkins's original design. His machine could crank out a staggering 3,000 kilograms of ice every single day. Refrigeration had finally moved out of the lab and into the factory. And just like that, the stage was set for a conflict you've probably never even heard of, the Great Ice War. This was an all-out brawl between a disruptive new technology and a deeply entrenched, incredibly powerful industry. Think about the two contenders here. In one corner, you've got natural ice, a massive, globe-spanning industry built on harvesting a resource from nature. And in the other corner, artificial ice, this strange new technology that promised to create that same exact resource anywhere, anytime. It was a classic David and Goliath story.
Now, the natural ice barons, they didn't just take this threat lying down. Oh no, they immediately launched these vicious smear campaigns. They told the public that this new machine-made ice was completely unnatural, that it would give you a fever, and that it tasted like the nasty chemicals used to make it.
Their tactics were all about fear. They played on the public's natural distrust of new technology, they stoked fears about explosions from early ammonia-based systems, and they kept pointing out how weird and, uncanny it was to literally create winter in the middle of summer. And this war wasn't over quickly. From Perkins's patent way back in 1834, it took nearly 70 years for artificial ice to finally start winning. So what was the turning point? What finally tipped the scales? Well, it wasn't just better technology.
The winner of the Great Ice War was decided by something completely unexpected. The battle for cold was ultimately won by the sanitary revolution.
So here's the thing. The natural ice industry had a fatal flaw, a real Achilles heel. As the Industrial Revolution charged forward, the very lakes and rivers they were harvesting their pure and natural ice from were getting more and more polluted. Their product wasn't so pure anymore. And this chart just shows the shift perfectly. Public perception did a complete 180. Trust in natural ice absolutely plummeted as people became more aware of germs and diseases in the water. Meanwhile, trust in that manufactured, so-called unnatural ice, it soared. So all of a sudden, artificial ice wasn't just a novelty anymore. It was the clear winner because it was reliable. You could make it anywhere. And most importantly, it was guaranteed to be free of pathogens. It was, simply put, the safer, more hygienic choice.
Now, this victory, it wasn't just about making better ice cubes. The victory of artificial cold was, in reality, a conquest of heat itself, and it completely remade the modern world.
All right, let's talk about a ghost. An invention that was so far ahead of its time, it completely failed, but was so brilliant that it ended up secretly shaping the entire modern world of sound.
So, I've got a question for you. When you think of the 19th century, what do you actually hear? Besides horses and steam engines.
What does a recorded voice from that time sound like to you? And hey, if you're picturing one of those old-timey record players with the big horn scratching away at a wax cylinder, well, you're on the right track, but you're missing the most mind-blowing idea of them all. See, the real sound of the future wasn't carved at all. It was invisible.
To really get why this was such a huge deal, we have to start with the undisputed king of sound back then, Thomas Edison and his famous phonograph.
Now, the phonograph was this incredible piece of mechanical wizardry. It literally worked by taking the vibrations from a sound and using a needle to scratch a physical groove into a spinning cylinder of wax. To play it back, you just did the whole thing in reverse. It worked. But while the entire world was obsessed with carving physical grooves, a Danish engineer named Valdemar Poulsen had a totally different idea in 1898. I mean, it was an idea that sounded like something out of a science fiction novel. He wanted to capture sound not in an object, but in an invisible force.
And this just shows you, we're talking about two completely different ways of thinking. Edison's method was physical, mechanical. You could see the recording, but it would also wear out over time. Poulsen's idea was, well, it was almost ethereal. It used magnetism, creating an invisible pattern that, in theory, would never wear down. This was a massive leap.
So, what did he call this thing? The telegraphophone. Instead of curving grooves, it used electromagnetism to store sound on a thin steel wire. You can think of it like writing with invisible magnetic ink. The sound is there, you just can't see it. So how did this magic trick actually work? Well, it's surprisingly simple when you break it down. You talk into a microphone, and the electrical signal makes an electromagnet flicker. As a steel wire zips past it, the magnet imprints a matching magnetic signature onto it. And to listen back, you just run the wire past the magnet again, which recreates the original signal that you hear in an earpiece. Pretty cool, right? Now, an invention this wild needed a big stage, right? And boy, did it get one, at pretty much the most famous tech showcase on the planet at the time. We're talking the 1900s Paris Exposition. This was the place to be. I mean, it was this glittering showcase of everything the future was supposed to hold, from the first diesel engines to moving sidewalks. And right in the middle of all of it was Valdemar Poulsen with his telegraphone. And yeah, people were blown away by it. But the telegraphone was about to have its one shining moment in the spotlight, a moment that would literally be heard over a century later.
Get this, Emperor Franz Joseph of Austria himself, one of the most powerful rulers on the planet, walks right up to this strange new machine and records his voice onto that little strand of steel wire. And here's the crazy part, that recording, it still exists. Think about that. Today, it is the oldest magnetic audio recording we have. A voice, clear as day, from the year 1900, captured not in a groove, but in a magnetic field.
So you'd think, okay, royal seal of approval, World's Fair buzz, this thing's gonna take over the world, right? Nope. This is where the story gets kind of sad, because this absolutely brilliant idea was destined to be a massive failure. And you have to understand what Poulsen was going for. He wasn't really thinking about recording music or anything like that. He was a true visionary. He actually sold the telegraphone to businesses as a device to record telephone messages when no one was around. He had invented the world's first telephone answering machine in 1898. But, you know, having a great idea is one thing. Making it work in the real world, that's another story entirely. And despite its genius, the telegraphophone was a total commercial flop. Nobody wanted it. So why? What went wrong? Well, it was a whole list of really practical, annoying problems. First, the magnetic signal was incredibly weak. The technology to amplify it electronically, things like the vacuum tube, didn't exist yet, so you had to listen to it on headphones. You couldn't just play it out loud. And the wire itself, oh, it was a nightmare. It would twist up and distort the sound, and worse, it would get tangled into this horrible metal mess. But here's the thing, the machine might have been a failure, but the idea was perfect. It wasn't dead, it was just waiting. Poulsen had planted the seeds for everything that came next.
See, his concept was like a lock, but the world hadn't invented the keys yet. It was missing just two crucial ingredients to unlock its real power. First, you needed a way to make that tiny, weak signal loud. That's electronic amplification, which came later with the vacuum tube. And second, you needed something better than that tangly steel wire. The solution? Plastic tape coated with iron oxide, what we all know now as magnetic tape. It was stable, it was practical, and it didn't tangle. And once you had those two things, amplification and tape, Poulsen's idea didn't just work, it took over the world. It became the foundation for everything: reel-to-reel audio, cassette tapes, videotapes, and even the data on computer hard drives and credit cards. His lost invention was reborn as the sound of the 20th century. You know, when you think of the Victorian era, you probably think of this incredible explosion of genius, right? Steam power, photography, just so much innovation. But here's the puzzle. Why did some of its most amazing ideas, the ones that could have literally fast-forwarded the future, just fizzle out? So that's the big question, isn't it? We're going to dive into why this era, so bursting with new ideas, just couldn't seem to capitalize on some of its own biggest breakthroughs. It's a story of what could have been, of ideas that were just a little too ahead of their time. And this really lays it all out for us, the huge gap between promise and reality. On one side, you've got these world-changing ideas. Babbage's analytical engine, basically the first blueprint for a computer. The wild concepts that tiny, invisible germs cause disease. And the telephodone, a magnetic recorder that was decades ahead of its time. And on the other side, the reality check. They were never built, they were fought tooth and nail, or they were just forgotten. So what on earth was getting in the way? All right, so let's dig into our first roadblock. And this one is a physical one. It's about the very stuff these inventions were supposed to be made of. Because it turns out you can have the most brilliant idea in the world, but if the materials and tools of your era can't keep up, that idea is destined to stay on the drawing board. And this gap, this huge chasm between an inventor's perfect, logical plan and the clunky, imperfect metal they actually had to work with, that's the real problem. And wow, if anyone felt this, it was Charles Babbage with his incredible analytical engine. I mean, you have to understand, Babbage was so far ahead of the curve, it's almost hard to believe. His designs needed thousands of really complex, identical parts, but the machine tools back in the 1840s just weren't precise enough. The whole idea of standardized parts didn't even exist yet, so every single little gear had to be custom made by hand. You can imagine the nightmare, constant issues with friction, jamming. His genius had just completely outrun what the Industrial Revolution was capable of building. It's a great reminder that even today, a breakthrough in software can be totally held back by the limits of our hardware. Okay, so you've got the materials sorted out, but what if the minds of the time just aren't ready for your idea? This brings us to our second roadblock, and this one wasn't physical at all. It was all in their heads, a deep-seated resistance to ideas you couldn't see or wrap your mind around. And a lot of the time, the biggest barrier was simply that you couldn't see the idea. I mean, think about it. If you're a doctor and you've spent your entire life believing that sickness comes from bad air or miasmas, how do you suddenly switch to believing in what Louis Pasteur called invisible animals? It was a huge leap of faith. And the pushback? Wow, it could be absolutely extreme. This story is just wild. Max von Pettenkofer, a really well-known scientist, was so sure his miasma theory was right that in 1892, he publicly drank a glass of water full of cholera bacteria, just to prove germ theory was wrong. Now, he actually survived, probably just dumb luck and strong stomach acid. But can you imagine? That's how far people would go to defend what they knew against a scary, new, invisible idea. And this skepticism about things that seemed unnatural wasn't just limited to medicine. Take artificial ice, for example. The idea of making ice in the middle of summer, people thought it was just wrong. Why? Because it completely separated a natural event, cold, from its season, winter. It felt like cheating nature, and that perception actually slowed down the use of refrigerators in homes for decades. Okay, so let's say you've got the perfect machine, and people are finally starting to get their heads around your idea. You'd think you're all set, right? Well, not quite. Our last roadblock is all about the money. If there's no business model, no economic ecosystem to actually support your invention, it's dead in the water. This is such a great example of that. You had Valdemar Poulsen's telegraphone, which used magnetic wire to record sound. For office dictation, the technology was way better than anything else. The problem? It was really quiet. And guess what hadn't been invented yet? Amplification. At the same time, you have Edison's phonograph. It's loud, it's clunky, it's purely mechanical, but it captured everyone's imagination as a fun entertainment device. Edison found his market, and the superior technology just faded away.
waiting for another invention to come along and make it useful.
And this brings us right back to poor Charles Babbage, because his funding situation was, well, it was nothing like what we have today. The British government originally gave him money to build a practical calculator, the difference engine. But Babbage's vision got bigger. He started designing a universal, programmable computer, the analytical engine. His sponsors took one look at it and lost all interest. They just saw this incredibly expensive, complicated toy and couldn't imagine what on earth it would be used for. There was no venture capital to turn to, so the money just vanished.
So after all that, imperfect metal, invisible ideas, no business plan, it's easy to look back and just call these inventions failures, right? The computer that was never built, the recorder that no one could hear. But here's the twist. They weren't failures. Not really. They were actually laying the groundwork for everything that came next. This is a really powerful way to think about it. The first part of the Industrial Revolution was all about muscle, the brute force of steam and steel. But these failed inventions, they were about something new. They were about nerves, an age built on these subtle, invisible forces like electricity, biology, and pure logic.
It's almost like these innovations were a massive software update for the hardware of the industrial world. Pasteur and his germs, Babbage and his logic, Poulsen and his magnetic wires, these weren't just gadgets. They were basically installing a new operating system for how we see the world, getting everyone's minds ready for the 20th century.
And that, right there, is their real legacy. These pioneers didn't just build stuff. They literally expanded the universe of what we could see and understand. They forced us to look through a lens and see a microbe, to look through our own flesh and see a bone, and to look at a stack of punched cards and see the very architecture of logic itself.
So what's the big takeaway from all this? The Victorians teach us that innovation is never a solo act. A great idea, a spark of genius, that's just not enough. For that spark to turn into a real fire, the whole world around it, the industry, the economy, even just the way people think, it all has to be ready to catch the flame.
And that kind of leaves us with one last question to chew on. We see incredible new things all the time, right? In AI, in quantum computing, genetic engineering. But looking back at these Victorian pioneers, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? What are the breakthroughs happening right now that are basically like Babbage's engine? Totally brilliant, completely revolutionary, but just waiting for the rest of us to catch up. Something to think about.